Chapter 3 Proud Warriors. We surrendered to the natural rhythm of the jungle, by which our working hours were regulated. The song of birds heralded the early morning freshness and the rising of the sun. Invariably their singing ceased about 9 o'clock, when the sun's power increased. That silent transition was then filled by the gay stridence of the cicada, and if one listened carefully one could hear the incessant hum of myriads of insects, the unmistakable sawing sound of the giant iguana in the thicket, and the cooing of pigeons. As evening approached, the birds gave the signal that the suffocation of the day was coming to an end. This sort of climate produced a psychological effect upon the white man. It caused him to cease his hurrying and his concern for the value of time. Theoretically we accepted this, but the mind was uneasy and rebelled against the enforced inactivity to which we had to submit while we were waiting for the missionary. It so happened that we had the pleasure of making a friend of affable disposition, whose intellect was not confined by the narrowness of his circle. His name was Alucard Neves, and he was the head of the radio station. His great friendliness and disinterested assistance were most valuable to us. It is fitting that I should mention him here, for he was a most important part of Savantina and was quite a character. Having established a bridge of brilliantine with Chief Uribuena, we obtained his approval for the visits we made to his village from time to time. At first the natives maintained a close reserve, tolerating us without understanding why we were observing them, and then writing something in a notebook. Frequently our notebooks were passed from hand to hand. I explained to them very imperfectly my interest as an observer. They showed neither distrust nor surprise, and with an astonishing enthusiasm took the matter very seriously and tried to help me. When a warrior was performing some task which he thought I did not know about, he would come and fetch me, show me the job he was doing, and point to the notebook. On my making a note of it, and showing him the sheet of paper on which I had written, he would nod delightedly, although he had not the least idea what the characters meant, for they themselves had no form of writing whatever. I learned many things through my contact with this village, although it lacked the true savant spirit, since idleness or laziness affected their lives as a direct consequence of depending for a living upon the settlers. The savant point of view was that they did not see why they should not take advantage of the farms, since this was indeed their land. In spite of that, they responded to friendliness with sincerity. One morning we received a surprise which deeply moved us. Among the tribe was a splendid fellow named Uira, and our attention was drawn to him and his family. Several times we went fishing with this warrior, who clearly occupied an important position in the village. We never overdid it with regard to the presents we gave him, so as better to study his character and disinterested reactions. With his enthusiastic help, I added somewhat to the nucleus of words which I had acquired of their difficult and guttural dialect, which derived from the linguistic family known as G. On that day, as on many others, Uira made his presence known to us across the doorway of our dwelling. We greeted him, but instead of coming in, he broadened his smile in an evidently embarrassed manner. We supposed he was going to ask us for something, and offered him a cup of coffee. Something was on his mind. He took a long time to drink the coffee, then suddenly he put down the cup and went outside. We followed him. We were certainly intrigued by his behavior. He picked up something from behind a bush and offered it to Norma. It was a magnificent spear of a very rare wood, which I had casually admired once. We tried to refuse the gift, but he wouldn't hear of it. Then he hastened to another bush and came back this time with a bow and 3 arrows, which he thrust into my hand. We would never have imagined that an Indian could affect us like this. he was aware of our embarrassment and wanted to take leave of us. In the gentlest possible manner, I asked him whether there was anything he wanted. He replied that there was not, and as if ashamed that a warrior should create a situation so charged with sentiment, he hurried away from us with his agile and graceful hunter's strides. His gesture provided us with a most delightful memory. When we told them about it in Zavantina, they regarded the story as incredible, and urged us to check over our belongings to make sure nothing had been stolen. There was no doubt that so long as this kind of mentality persisted on the part of the settlers, even though it was not without justification, they would never come to any understanding with the natives. Dry weather had now settled in. A gleaming sun and a cloudless sky reigned from dawn to twilight. Owing to Zavantina clay soil, and very possibly to the snake's curiosity, we found and killed a few yards away from our lodging 2 poisonous vipers, both yarards, whose bite is fatal. We got one in the morning and the other in the afternoon. Generally, in spite of the mosquitoes, before going to bed, we used to take a walk along the river bank. To the pleasure of stretching our legs after an oppressively hot day was added the mystery of the dark, forbidding jungle. The sound of the rushing river, the gleam of the myriad stars in its waters, the isolated cry of a bird, and the changeless background of chirping crickets and croaking frogs. The thermometer seemed to have gone crazy. The daily reading showed that the mercury rose midday to 118, and even high as 122, to drop when the sun set to 68, and at midnight to as low as 41 to 44. These abrupt changes of temperature, similar to those which occur in the desert, were to retard our metabolism and adaptation to the Mato Grosso environment more than we had bargained for. We made up our minds to do without the missionary, and we began to plan our voyage by canoe. There were no maps of the river's course, and 2 people who knew it disagreed as to location and negotiation of rapids. It cost us many patient hours of concentration and drawing of diagrams, aided by cigars and generous helpings of cachaça, or Brazilian drink of high alcoholic content, before we could get a rough idea of the river's rocky obstacles over nearly a 200-mile course, when we should glimpse the Zavant village that lay beside it. From there on, if the Zavants did not kill us, the shrugging of the settlers' shoulders did not give us much to hope for. It happened as things generally do happen in the jungle, unexpectedly. This is not so much because the events are so surprising in themselves, but because time has ceased to have any significance in the mind. One evening the Salesian missionary arrived. His name was Pedro Spardellato. He was taking gifts as peace offerings to a group of Zavants considered implacable, in order to further as far as possible former contacts established by brethren of his fraternity who had been killed by Zavant warriors. His sudden advent into our lives was like a gust of wind bursting upon a sultry summer afternoon. There was no doubt he was an amusing character, heart and soul a missionary, determined, courageous, practical, and possessed of inestimable fervor for the execution of his cause. A few words sufficed to persuade him to prepare for taking us downriver. He had no time for lengthy conversation, owing to the rainy season, which had made it difficult for him to obtain the supplies he had brought. He was already considerably delayed. Thus, after the scantiest preparations, which we regarded as over-hasty, and with an outboard motor of which one cylinder failed at least every 6th time it was started, we made ready to depart exactly 36 hours after the missionary's arrival. It was morning just like any other, with the difference that we were taking a transcendental step. That step was to carry us into an unknown world, and one which, leaving behind us the last weak link with civilization, would cause our survival to depend exclusively upon ourselves and our equipment. The quantity of material piled up on the sand was considerable. Axes, spades, machetes, bales, tents, tarpaulins, chests, arms, blankets, hammocks, and 101 other things, not to mention 100 liters, 22 gallons of petrol, were all waiting to be fitted in somehow. Our own equipment was scanty, nothing but what was absolutely essential, and barely even that. It was the only way that the canoe could sustain the weight of a small expedition. The missionary wagged his long beard in approbation at what we were taking with us, and suggested that we should increase the amount of raspadura, a sort of honey made from the juice of sugar cane, which he considered very beneficial to the system and in dealing with the savages. As for me, I was beset by uneasiness. It seemed impossible for a narrow, though long canoe hollowed out of a tree trunk with a hatchet to hold all that stuff. With Franciscan patience and a strength one would never have imagined his tiny frame capable of exerting, the missionary went ahead with the loading. When the canoe tilted dangerously to one side, he shook his head and shifted the load until the craft attained a satisfactory equilibrium. Several times he offset this dip by placing a complementary weight in the other end. I wondered whether, when it came to setting up camp, he would remember this original arrangement, or whether the canoe would turn turtle and pitch all the stuff into the water. At 5 o'clock in the morning we had set to work to arrange the cargo. It was now 10:30, and we were about to cast off our moorings, when there was not a package left on the beach. The canoe's gunwale and some 2 inches above the water Inspired by the unshakable faith of the missionary, we offered up a silent prayer that his altruistic work might be crowned with blessing in spite of his defiance of the most elementary principles of equilibrium and capacity. The first attempt to start the motor failed. It was a 10-horsepower relic from way back. At the 7th attempt, we took our leave of Zavantina and of Father Kolbashini, the well-known Salesian priest who had played an effective part in the pacification of the Indian tribes known as the Boros, and who for 30 years had given himself up to such labors of love. Very soon, much too soon it seemed, the powerful current caused the cane support of the radio antenna to be swept away after a sudden swirl. After the joy we experienced in having set off on our journey at last, we now found ourselves affected by a strange sense of loneliness difficult to define. Then the sights that met our eyes took possession of our senses. The course of the river neither narrowed nor broadened to any extent as we wended our way along it. Lianas, creeping plants, and trees with tufted tops and whitish trunks greedily overhung the river, woven into a twisted, compact, tangled mass. From the canoe the jungle looked gentle and peaceful, but deceptively, for its natural inhabitants were the jaguar, which flourishes abundantly, hungry wolf with reddish-yellow coat, the crafty peccary, a kind of small wild boar, stag tapir, and the boa constrictor, which lies in wait for the herds of wild pigs. To these must be added the plagues of the area, the Anopheles mosquito, the shigo, the small fly called Barracuda, drunkard, because of its inordinate addiction to warm blood, the vermella, red piranha, and the venomous serpent, whose lurking is a prelude to death. Flocks of waterfowl, kingfishers, and ducks with long hooked bills, which were waiting ahead of us every now and then, flew off as we approached, only to return and settle as soon as the canoe had passed. Some 3 miles from our starting point, we veered to starboard and struck violently against a high bank in front of 2 huts belonging to some settlers. The jolt was terrific, but this was in fact the only way to stop, for the outboard motor provided no means of slowing down. I saw with alarm that the reason for the halt was to take on more cargo. This was in the form of sweet pumpkins, of which the missionary said the natives were very fond. The missionary evidently committed his work into God's hands, for nothing but an incalculable faith could submit a craft already overloaded to such an additional risk. The gunwale of the canoe was now only an inch or so above the level of the water. The river's course followed curve after curve. Sometimes it was confined between high cliffs, at others by belts of sand, but always in sight of the virgin forest. We took our midday meal in the canoe, proceeding at full speed, performing balancing tricks over the stowed objects to reach the food. Although I had supposed we should lunch on one of the many beaches, however, apparently delays of any kind, whether necessary or not, did not enter into the good missionary's scheme of things. Without warning, the current of the river had become strong and more boisterous. We hardly had time to become aware of it, when a deafening din drowned the noise of the motor. We looked inquiringly at the missionary, and he shouted that we were about to encounter the first of the rapids. We hung on to the sign cameras and hastily grabbed whatever was handiest, and seemed to us most important to protect in case we capsized. The sight that met our eyes was profoundly disquieting. Roaring water in a mass of white foam was climbing and leaping over black rocks, to fall into whirlpools revealing more rocks and an accumulation of withered tree trunks. The canoe sprang forward like a runaway, with a large part of its length out of the water and neatly standing on its stern. For the first time the missionary almost stopped the motor. We missed some boulders by inches and skillfully zigzagged between the rocks and the swiftly swirling vortex. Water washed in over the gunwales and the prow, and as the waters broke on the rocks, a fine spray drenched us well and truly. We counteracted the swaying of the craft until we emerged, as if shot from a catapult, between a sandbank and a bank of stones, into a backwater surrounded by white sand. The perilous passage had lasted at the most a minute and a half, though to us it had seemed that it would be the end of our journey. The peacefulness of the backwater and the smooth sand calmed us somewhat. It was astonishing that only a few yards away from where such violence existed, with the seeming certainty of tragedy, there should be this peace. We disembarked while the evening sun was still shining, and busied ourselves with setting up the first camp of the expedition. After drying our clothes, gathering firewood, and trimming some branches to drive into the sand to hang our hammocks on, cups of hot coffee and a few cookies were as welcome as a banquet. The fire that heated our supper cast its orange glow upon the sand. The tents protected us from the dampness and the light wind that, as evening fell, agitated the treetops and ruffled the surface of the backwater. The sky, as usual, sparkled intensely. The spell cast by the surroundings and the atmosphere affected us profoundly. There was a magic as well as fear in the river of the dead. The plans we had made so long before were reaching towards fulfillment, yet nothing of that which had seized us and impelled us had lost any of its irresistible attraction. On the second day of the voyage, in the early afternoon, huge dense clouds formed in the north. This was something most unusual, and when I expressed my doubts as to whether the dry weather would hold against the threatened storm, the missionary asserted categorically that never in all his long experience in the Mato Grosso had it rained at this time of year. But 10 minutes later we were engulfed in a torrential downpour. I had taken precautions and covered our paraphernalia with a tarpaulin, and with another had made a shelter, which protected us fairly well. The rain was so violent that visibility did not extend to 10 yards ahead of the prow of the canoe. The river bank appeared as little more than a grayish line through the sheet of water. I expected from one moment to the next that the missionary would pull into the shore until the storm abated. I supposed wrongly. The priest stoically drove the craft forward, soaked to the skin as he was, because he had refused to believe that it would rain. He went on bailing water out of the boat with one hand while attending to the tiller with the other. Just as suddenly as the rain had begun, so it stopped and moved away in huddled clouds towards the south. Once again the sun appeared and enabled us to dry ourselves in its welcome heat. But the equipment had suffered. Now we had to check up on the photometers, the films. For the rest of this stage of our journey, our attention was taken up by the work of airing and drying delicate equipment while maintaining the canoe's equilibrium. Until then, we had not realized the extremes of the climate in those regions, but that night we found out, in spite of the fact that we lay down fully dressed in sleeping bags zipped up to the necks, and with all the blankets that we could lay hands on over us. The cold was so intense that it made our teeth chatter. Nervous tension and anxious expectation affected us all the next day, the third since our departure from Savantina. The infamous din of our ancient motor announced our approach from a goodly distance, and according to the missionary, at any moment now we should be sighted by some hunting party from the village we were to visit on the banks of the River of the Dead. It was still some hours to sundown when we came to a halt against one of the many cliffs. As he leapt ashore to tie up the canoe, the missionary's laconic, "Well, we made it," gave me quite a shock. His bushy, massive beard could not conceal the inward bliss that lit up his face. Everything was silence, and oppressive silence, because we knew that although no voice could be heard, there must be Indians at their daily tasks. A narrow path, worn by continual use, showed us the way. We left our weapons, and with smiles on our lips, including those of the missionary, who had removed his pith helmet and replaced it by a headband of Invera vegetable fiber, we started off. The sun beat down upon us, and owing to the recent rain, a dense mist arose from the undergrowth. The insects hummed loudly, and a flight of parrots noisily interrupted our meditations. We went forward slowly, trying to penetrate the tangled vegetation with our eyes to discover some sign of life. Then the path forked and revealed a clearing. On the other side of that we saw the huts characteristic of the Zavants. In their traditional circular formation, from the first hut no smoke issued. The silence became more intense, accentuated by the deserted appearance of the village. If we had not known that these warriors never laid an ambush in their own village, and that, on the contrary, when at war, they defended it fiercely, we would promptly have turned and fled, especially as the two brothers belonging to the missionaries' fraternity, who should have been there to welcome us, showed no sign of life. It was only natural to imagine the worst when one was among Zavant warriors. The missionary, however, suggested that the tribe had gone out hunting. This was natural enough with the Zavant, who, being essentially a nomad in his hunting trips, was just as likely to cover 50 or 100 miles as 5. Distance meant nothing to him. The smell of the wood of the Zavant's burn impregnated the village. The openings to the huts were covered up with branches. In the center was the place reserved for the tribal council, and to one side, half destroyed by fire, remained the hollowed gourds which these tribes used for various chores. This was the principal indication that they had gone off on a long raid. The mission consisted of a long shack in the shape of a hammer, built of vertical sticks and covered with palm leaves, which was situated on the outskirts of the Zavant village. It boasted a plantation of cassava, a kind of tapioca, by the side of a stream that supplied it with water. The other two missionaries were busy felling trees for a new dwelling. That was why they had not heard the motor of the canoe. One was of Spanish origin, short of stature, with a bushy beard and sparkling eyes, whose experience included 25 years' exploration of the rivers of the Mato Grosso. The other was tall and young, with a penetrating and intelligent expression. Both of them were amazed to see that a white woman, especially one of such a very feminine appearance as Norma, should venture into that zone. Long savant arrows pierced the roofs of the mission shack. The missionaries had endured moments of unpleasant anxiety when our padre did not arrive with food. The savants, before going away to hunt, had given expression to their disappointment by peppering the roof and walls of the missionaries' building with arrows. Dozens of shafts projected from the leaves of the dwellings. Now I understand why the missionary had been in such a hurry to get there. That night we talked very little. The missionary was a man of few words, and we were assailed by a number of doubts which we hardly dared to analyze inwardly. Would the missionary's presence be enough to restrain the bellicose tendencies which white people aroused in the savants? What would their verdict be? Would we be allowed to stay? How would they react to us, although I had never got used to sleeping in a hammock, and I found it painfully difficult to adapt myself to its pronounced curvature? This was not the reason why I could not close my eyes that night. Excitement, anxiety, and restlessness mingled in my mind. I did not know which of these sensations was uppermost. Hardly had dawn broken and daylight lit up the tops of the trees when we were up and doing. The hours went by slowly. We were making notes of the location of the village when something, possibly a sixth sense, for the silence was absolute, made us cast our eyes towards one of the jungle tracks. What we saw made us walk very slowly towards where the missionary stood. 5 warriors, the red paint on their bodies splashed with mud, carrying their weapons and on their backs great bundles of arrows, were advancing in single file. They showed signs of weariness. Apparently their intention was to go up to the missionary, but as they caught sight of us they changed their minds and walked on with indifference. They were followed by a group of young warriors who ignored the missionary and who cast in our direction looks which were eloquent with pride and scorn at the same time. One of them, not content with the manifestation of displeasure, drew back the string of his bow and let it go violently without shooting an arrow. We had no time to ponder this unfriendly action, for more Indians were coming. These were the women. After consulting the missionary, we feverishly set up a camera. Norma went back a bit, and concealing the camera among the leaves of a bush, took the first shots of the savants. The gait of the women had lost its natural elasticity. It was heavy and laborious. The march must have been a tough one. Palm fiber baskets full of venison, tapir, and bacari hung from their foreheads, necks, and shoulders. Besides this load, they carried the usual paraphernalia consisting of the common family appurtenances, which generally exceed 100 pounds in weight. And that was not all. On top of this pyramid, they were carrying their babies. Their complete nudity was partly hidden by shoulder cords, small mats made of babasu palm fiber, which are worn to prevent loads from causing sores. They showed signs of being exhausted, and their bodies and long hair were caked with crust of mud. The arms of many of them were lacerated with deep cuts, probably caused by thorns and dwarf palms, which are very plentiful throughout that region, and by the extreme rapidity with which they had been obliged to march. They passed without taking any notice of us. On the other hand, some of the children smiled at us, while others openly shunned us. A few little girls led small wild pigs on strings. We had been focusing our attention on a single path, and therefore the shock brought our camera work to an abrupt conclusion when, almost at our side, there silently emerged a group of warriors belonging to the escort of the chief, who followed behind. They looked at us, including the missionary, with stern sullenness. The chief was a splendid fellow, very tall and statuesquely proportioned. His features were long and rather fine, except that his lips were somewhat thick. He could not have been more than 30 years of age. Like the rest of his people, he was naked, and the usual adornments, as well as his muscular body, were stained with mud. As an additional mark of ostentation, he wore a most curious necklace. From a thick cord of woven thread hung, each inserted into a little ball of natural rubber, two long animal tusks, which I imagined was some manatee of the river. His restless black eyes fixed themselves on us for a moment, and then on the missionary. He changed his spear over to his left hand, and then extending his right, said by way of greeting, "Sawadi, friend." The Salesian replied in the same manner, and added, "Friend, my very good friend." During this the escort of warriors went on its way, and a conversation took place between the missionary and the chief in the Zavant dialect concerning the hunt and how long it had lasted. About sickness and presents for the tribe we were ignored. The evening shadows had fallen when the missionary returned from tribal council. He came to fetch us and take us to where the chief, his captains, and the elders of the tribe were assembled. In the center of the village burned a large fire. Around it some 15 Zavants were seated on deerskin mats. One of them was talking in a low, well-modulated voice. Each of the warriors had his spear beside him, stuck into the ground within reach. As we approached, several started talking at once, which they do not customarily do. We took our places in a spot already selected for us, and the missionary began to speak. The faces lit up by the flames were hard and sullen, as if they resented our presence, but even stronger than this hostility was their curiosity. They looked at us with rapt attention, especially at Norma, who sat smiling under their rigorous inspection. She was the first white woman who had ever visited them, and probably it was the first time in their lives as warriors that two white people other than missionaries were apparently not afraid of them. We got the impression that they were not taking much notice of what the missionary was saying. They must have learnt from him already why we had come, and so this was just a pantomime to enable them to have a good look at us. The warrior at my side suddenly snatched from me the flashlight I was carrying. He fumbled with it, but could not find how to switch it on until I showed him. My reserve of flashlight batteries was low, so after he had turned it on and off over and over again, I asked him for it back. His reply was an emphatic, and he went on playing with it. I realized that the warrior's action was premeditated. Gently I withdrew his spear from the ground and balanced it in my hand. This angered him, for he almost tore the spear out of my hand, and gave me back the flashlight at the same time, without any change of expression. Although I did not feel at all sure, I knew how to restore the situation with prudence. I gave him back the flashlight and smiled at him, adding that his fine spear must belong to a most valiant warrior and friend. He looked me up and down, then gave me back the flashlight without any violent gesture. I received the impression that from that moment on an incipient friendship was making itself felt. The missionary's glance confirmed that. The chief, who had not spoken before, stood up and said something, which the missionary translated for me. The council would allow me to remain in the village until the sun had risen 10 times. He held up both hands with the fingers spread. After that we would have to go. Excitement was consuming me as the day dawned. Between the poles of the mission shack there was a space of about the thickness of 2 fingers, through these chinks the dawn light was filtering, which gave a vague, indefinite form to everything. Then the interior was lit by stripes of light which enabled us to see the boxes of equipment, the utensils we used for our food, and the scores of tarantulas dried up and lifeless, dangling in the frigid early morning breeze. I found I was not the only one who was awake. Norma also had been overcome with excitement and expectancy. When she realized that I was looking at her, she sprang from her hammock, shook her boots in case some unpleasant intruder had got into them, and went over to peer through the poles. The exclamation she gave vent to made me jump. 2 children about 8 years old were watching her through the very opening she had picked on. When she called out to them, they ran away as fast as they could. We waited for the missionary and prepared a breakfast of coffee and powdered milk and some biscuits. Our policy was to act always with prudence, consulting the missionary continually before doing anything, for we appreciated that we were in a territory where the slightest indiscretion might cause the loss of everything. We had somehow to win the confidence of the tribe, for this was the only way we could hope to approach the parent village. This tribe had ties of blood and affinity with the parent tribe, and what was more, there was a real friendship between them, for they exchanged visits from time to time. We were finishing our meal when the missionary entered. He had the quality of converting peace into bustle by virtue of his extraordinary energy. He opened the knapsacks, and taking medicines out of them, barely vouchsafed to reply to our questions in monosyllables. He told us that many Indians were unwell, owing to the inclemency of the weather and the weakening effects of the hunt and forced marches. When we offered to help him and to provide antibiotics, his countenance lit up, and he smiled with gratitude. The good missionary was that indeed a missionary in the fullest sense of the word, as were also his 2 hard-working colleagues. Without a morsel of food having passed his lips, huge bags under his eyes, his beard and hair unkempt, and his head band and clothing mud-splashed, he was the incarnation of self-sacrifice, surrounding himself meekly to the consuming passion of his calling. Though I am no fervent Catholic myself, I could not help admiring his iron will. We sterilized needles, and with thermometers, anti-malaria pills, sulfonamide ointments, methylene blue, and penicillin, we followed the other missionary who was in charge of the dressings, who was called Father John. As we left the beaten track, we found ourselves splashing about in mud. Almost all the members of the tribe were resting in their dwellings from the effects of the weary march of the previous day. Those who were outside were mostly women and children, the women making and tending small fires to roast the meat obtained from the hunt, kneeling to kindle the feeble flames from the damp firewood with fans made of woven palm fibers. As soon as we approached, the women hastened into the huts, and the children hid themselves. When the missionary assured them in their own language, some of them looked at us half serious, half smiling, modestly covering their sexual organs with one hand, or placing a palm fiber shoulder guard over it, for they were stark naked. We tried to act as though we were not observing them at all, so as not to arouse their inhibitions. One good-looking and lively damsel gave my wife a broad smile. This delighted Norma, and encouraged her to approach her. The girl hung her head bashfully, but still smiled. Absorbed by this triumph, which seemed an earnest of greater ones to come, we were taken unawares. I felt a tearing at my trouser leg, and heard the furious barking of a retreating dog. The savant dog did not recognize our scent and had attacked us in a flash. We had to use some of the tincture of iodine we were carrying for the treatment of the Indians on my own calf. It was the first time in my life I had been bitten by a dog. As I went through the gap that served as a door into one of the huts, I heard the pitiful squeals of the dog, which was being soundly chastised. The Maloka hut was poorly lit by a central fire which gave out more smoke than heat. Inadvertently, in the gloom, I trod on the paw of a young wild pig, Jabato, which promptly reacted by biting me superficially on the ankle with its milk teeth. In this damp, stifling atmosphere, some 30 persons were herded together, as well as 6 jabatos, 4 dogs, and 3 parrots. All these pairs of eyes, the growling of the dogs, and the accelerated chattering of the parrots were turned upon us. My first impression of disorder was enormous. Each family occupied a set place, indicated by their sleeping mats placed against the circular walls of the hut, and they kept their appurtenances in palm fiber baskets and in bags of the same material, piled up beside the mats. From the walls projected dozens of arrows, carefully arranged so as not to damage the feathers, and hollowed-out pumpkins and gourds containing ornaments and paint. The earth floor was covered with coconut shells, broken pumpkin shells, and chopped firewood. The appearance of the Indians was distressing. There was not one without wounds, covered with mud. Their bodies were emaciated, and their faces gaunt, owing to the recent grueling trek and lengthy absence from home. We were summoned by one woman who pointed to her husband, a young warrior who was shivering, bathed in perspiration, malaria. The missionary told the woman to cover him with a mat and stop up the cracks at the level of the floor to prevent draughts. The savant seized the mat and looked at us with defiant eyes. The missionary covered him again, but the Indian, who was shivering like an aspen leaf with barely strength enough to move, seized his spear and with the other hand tore the mat away. I felt as if overcome by a strange emotion, something odd, which I shall never be able to define in words, but its effect was to make me begin to appreciate this race. A gentle voice, without any hint of a peremptory tone, spoke. On hearing it, the warrior put down his spear, and making a sign to his wife, allowed her to cover him, and took the anti-malaria pills. The person who had thus spoken, and who had stealthily approached to within a single pace from where I stood, was a superb example of a savant manhood. Taller than I, of powerful sinews, with penetrating, intelligent eyes framed in regular and delicate features, the effect of which was not changed by thick lips, he irradiated serene authority. Norma devoted herself enthusiastically to helping the missionary to give injections of antibiotics. At first her hands shook. The native skin is extremely tough, and the effort required to puncture it caused her forehead to be covered with perspiration. I provided illumination by means of a paraffin lamp, and very shortly the missionary became her assistant, carrying the box of medicines and handing her the syringes and needles. Neither the missionary nor I liked giving injections, although the patients did not appear to mind them in the least. We treated 2 children of tender years, whose bellies were enormously distended, the effect of parasites. One gave no trouble, the other was most difficult. We could not persuade him to swallow the medicine. The mother and father intervened, but without success. Neither of them raised their voice or used any kind of force to make the child take the stuff. It was a desperate case. The saving of the child's life depended upon the medicine. It was refusing to drink. We left the hut with deep regret. Pneumonia, conjunctivitis, malaria, intestinal parasites, and minor infected wounds afflicted the village. Fortunately, with a few drugs, we performed miracles. The savant possessed a body which was virgin for such medicaments, and the tiniest doses were sufficient to produce a formidable effect and hasten recuperation. Whereas the white man needed 1,000,000 units of penicillin, the same result would be attained in the Indian with 100,000. And in addition he had incredible stamina and resistance. Heart-rending wails were rising and falling with growing intensity. Sometimes they would be long drawn out in a most melancholy manner, at others would stop suddenly, only to begin again in a terrible agonizing yell. Not knowing what we should find, we made our way to a nearby hut. It was occupied by an Indian married couple. Both of them were squatting, their hair cut short, giving vent to their pain and sorrow in ritual wailing. At their feet, on a small mat, a 6-year-old girl lay dead. The mother leaned over the body in a continual swaying movement and bathed the child's chest with her tears. The missionary did not intervene at all, or try to console them, and no one else in the tribe did so either. The savants believed that lament for the death of a relative must be shared only by the nearest of kin. It would never occur to anyone to pity them, for this was their own grief and belonged to them alone, just as someday it would be the case with oneself. It was a hard school to our way of thinking, but it had a certain logic about it, born of necessity in the face of the tough existence of a tribe, guided by an inexorable tradition as famous warriors. When evening came, we had just finished packing up our medical equipment. Although my essential purpose was to try to make a film of these indomitable and unknown tribes, the camera were still in their cases. We were as yet strangers who could tell whether we should succeed in breaking down that barrier one day. The warriors ignored us completely. They despised us as they despised all white people, for they regarded us as an inferior tribe. They had always killed civilized men without compunction, setting ambushes to trap them with which a savant child could see through. And therein lay the worst disgrace a man could be guilty of, that of being an inefficient warrior. The younger warriors especially looked down upon us with the greatest scorn. If I went towards one of them, apparently carelessly, and watched what he was doing, he would utter a loud click of the tongue as a sign of irritation and turn his back on me. We were dining on a good joint of deer meat, which had been presented to the mission, when a chorus of loud and urgent voices sounded, as imperative as a drumbeat. The Salesian priest smiled approvingly, and still chewing the tasty venison, went outside, followed by ourselves and his two colleagues. The last thing I'd expected was to find myself confronted by an energetic, stirring dance. The warriors' vitality was astonishing. Unaffected by weariness or the pains they had endured, they were fulfilling their tribal customs as usual. Some 20 young warriors, in a circle and holding hands, were energetically moving their feet apart and closing up again in a sideways motion, at the same time chanting at the top of their voices a song dedicated to evening. My surprise knew no bounds when I recognized among them one savant whom I had given a shot of penicillin because he had shown symptoms of bronchopneumonia. The missionary guessed my thoughts, for he raised his head promptly and remarked to me in a whisper, "That's the savant for you." That night I smoked my pipe very slowly, seated outside the shack. The night was calm, and although somewhat cool, its tranquility invited contemplation. From where I sat, I could just see the missionary in the assembly of the tribal council at the chief's side. Farther on were the fires of the meeting of distinguished warriors, and still farther away, and almost on the very borders of the jungle, a third campfire indicated the presence of the warriors who spent the night alert, unsleeping, keeping watch and guard in the village. I was not invited to any of the meetings, and this isolation, which was precisely what I did not want, made me search hungrily for some formula which would enable me to be admitted into the society of these rude, proud warriors.